My name is Daniel, but most people just call me Dan. I'm 35 years old, and I've been married to my wife, Lisa, for almost 10 years. When we first met, I thought she was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. Lisa was smart, funny, and ambitious. We clicked almost instantly, and it wasn't long before we started dating seriously. Back then, we both had big dreams but little else. I was finishing up my degree in business administration while juggling part-time work, and she was building her career in marketing. We pushed each other to be better, and those early days of scraping by, dreaming big, and building a future together are some of my fondest memories. By the time we hit our late 20s, things started to fall into place. I landed a stable position as an operations manager for a mid-sized company, and Lisa got a great job at a local marketing firm. We worked hard, saved up, and bought a modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. Nothing fancy, but it was ours, and that mattered. Now, 10 years into marriage, life seemed settled. We weren't struggling anymore, but we weren't coasting either. We each had our own cars, mine a sensible SUV, hers a sleek sedan she'd saved up for. We didn't have kids, though we talked about it here and there, deciding to wait until we both felt ready. Our daily lives were routine but comfortable. We woke up together, had breakfast, and then went our separate ways for work. Evenings were spent watching TV, cooking dinner together, or occasionally going out to eat. Weekends were reserved for chores, visits with friends, or relaxing. It wasn't a life of extravagance, but it was stable and secure. Lisa had always been the more ambitious of the two of us. She talked a lot about climbing the corporate ladder, eventually landing an executive role. I admired her drive and tried to be supportive, even though my goals were more about steady progress and enjoying the journey. Over the years, I'd grown used to her passion for her career. It didn't bother me that she sometimes brought work home or talked endlessly about office drama. It was part of who she was, and I loved her for it. But lately, I'd started to notice little things. Nothing major, just the kind of quirks you might write off as a phase or a reaction to stress. A missed dinner here, an unexplained mood there. At the time, I didn't think much of it. After all, everyone has ups and downs, right? Looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention. Maybe if I had, I would have seen the cracks forming before everything fell apart. The first signs of something being off were small, almost insignificant. At first, I didn't even register them as signs. Lisa had always been diligent about her work, but lately, her dedication seemed to border on obsessive. She'd started coming home later than usual, claiming she was swamped with projects and deadlines. Another late night? I asked one evening as she walked through the door, her face flushed and hair slightly disheveled. Yeah, she replied, dropping her bag on the counter. We're rolling out this new campaign, and it's been chaos. Everyone's putting in extra hours. It sounded plausible enough. Marketing can be unpredictable, and I'd seen her stress over big projects before. But this time, something felt different. The late nights became more frequent, and soon, it wasn't just the hours that changed. Lisa started dressing differently for work, more polished and put together. She'd always been stylish, but now her outfits seemed deliberate, almost as if she were trying to impress someone. I noticed new jewelry, shoes, and even a fresh perfume she hadn't worn before. "You're looking sharp these days," I said one morning as she grabbed her coffee to go. She smiled but didn't make eye contact. "Just trying to keep up with the office vibe," she replied casually before hurrying out the door. At first, I told myself I was overthinking things. People change, and it's not like I expected Lisa to stay the same as she was 10 years ago. But the changes kept coming, and they weren't all good. Our conversations started to feel hollow. She wasn't as open with me as she used to be. When I asked about her day, I got vague answers or short replies. Gone were the lengthy recaps of office drama or her excited chatter about upcoming projects. Instead, she seemed distant, distracted, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. And then there were the nights she didn't come home until well after dinner. "I told you I had a meeting," she said one evening when I finally asked why she'd been out so late. "At 9 o'clock. I pressed, trying to keep my tone light. She sighed, brushing past me to grab a drink from the fridge. "Yeah, Dan. Sometimes meetings run late. You know how it is." Except I didn't. I'd worked plenty of late nights in my career, but meetings that stretched into the night? That was new to me. I started noticing other oddities, too. Her phone, which she used to leave lying around the house, was now always with her, either in her hand or tucked into her bag. She'd tilt the screen away when I was nearby or swipe away notifications as soon as they popped up. "Who's texting you so much?" I asked one evening, half joking but genuinely curious. "Oh, just the team," she said quickly, sliding the phone into her pocket. "Work stuff." Something about her tone made my stomach churn. Still, I tried to brush it off. Lisa was hardworking and ambitious, maybe more than I'd given her credit for. But the distance between us was growing, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. At the time, I told myself that it was all in my head. Stress could do strange things to people, and I wanted to believe that this was just a rough patch in her career, not a reflection of our marriage. But deep down, I think I already knew that something was changing, something I couldn't ignore forever. The little shifts I'd noticed before became harder to ignore as the weeks passed. Lisa was no longer just coming home late, she seemed emotionally distant even when she was around. It was like she was physically present but mentally checked out. Our usual routines fell apart. She started skipping dinner more often, claiming she'd already eaten at the office. Weekend plans were suddenly too much, as she said she needed to rest after her hectic weeks. Date nights, something we used to cherish, fizzled out completely. "I just need some space," she told me one Friday when I suggested we go to our favorite Italian place. "Work's been draining, and I'm exhausted." I backed off, telling myself it was just a phase. But it hurt, being shut out like that. Then came the promotions. Lisa had always been good at her job, but the speed at which she climbed the ladder in her company started raising questions. In just a few months, she'd gone from a mid-level position to overseeing entire campaigns. When she came home one evening and casually mentioned she was being promoted again, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of suspicion. "Another promotion?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "That's, the second one this year." She nodded, flashing a proud smile. "Third, actually. I've been killing it, Dan. They love what I bring to the table." While part of me wanted to be happy for her, another part couldn't ignore how sudden it all felt. Promotions in corporate environments didn't usually come that fast, not without some extraordinary circumstances. "Congrats," I said, forcing a smile. "You deserve it." But the truth was, I wasn't so sure anymore. Her late nights became even more frequent, and her explanations grew thinner. She started mentioning her boss more often, a man named Rick whom I'd met a few times at company events. He was a charming guy in his late 40s with a reputation for being both brilliant and ruthless. "Rick's been a great mentor," she said one evening when I casually asked about her new role. "Mentor, huh?" I replied, trying to mask the unease in my voice. Yeah, he's been in the industry for years. He's got so much insight. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But there was something in the way she talked about him that didn't sit right with me. Her tone was different, almost reverent. It wasn't long before I started noticing changes in her appearance, too. Lisa had always taken pride in how she looked, but now her efforts seemed almost excessive. She began buying new clothes, sleek, professional outfits that felt more tailored for a high-powered executive than the Lisa I knew. Another shopping spree? I joked one evening as she came home with bags from a high-end boutique. She shrugged. Just upgrading my wardrobe. It's important to look the part. Her phone, once a minor concern, became a major red flag. She was glued to it constantly, and her behavior around it grew more secretive. She'd step out of the room to take calls or reply to texts, and when I'd ask who it was, her answers were always vague. "Oh, just Rick," she'd say. "He's been texting about work stuff." I wanted to believe her, but something in her tone felt off. One evening, I decided to press her a bit. "You're spending a lot of time with Rick," I said as casually as I could. She looked up from her phone, her expression unreadable. "He's my boss, Dan. Of course I'm spending time with him. Doesn't it seem excessive, though? I mean, all these late nights, the constant texting. It's like you're married to the job now." She sighed, setting her phone down on the counter. "Dan, I'm doing this for us. For our future. Why are you making it sound like a bad thing?" Her words stung, and I felt a wave of guilt. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe she really was just caught up in the whirlwind of a demanding career. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something she wasn't telling me. The weeks that followed were some of the most unsettling of my life. Lisa's behavior grew even more puzzling, and a gnawing feeling in my gut refused to go away. Her late nights at the office, the constant messages from Rick, the way she avoided eye contact when I asked about her day, it was all piling up. One evening, I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I followed her. I hated myself for even considering it. Trust is supposed to be the foundation of a marriage, and here I was, about to break it by playing detective. But the thought of continuing to live in the dark, questioning everything, was unbearable. It was a Friday night, and Lisa had told me she'd be working late again. "Another campaign meeting," she'd said, brushing me off as she grabbed her keys and headed out the door. I waited about 15 minutes before getting into my car and driving toward her office. I told myself I'd only check to see if she was where she said she'd be. If I saw her car in the parking lot, I'd turn around and go home, no harm done. When I pulled into the lot, her car wasn't there. My heart sank, and my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. Maybe she parked somewhere else, I thought, trying to cling to some thread of rationality. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I sat there for a few minutes, debating my next move. That's when I remembered the restaurant near her office, a trendy spot where she'd mentioned having meetings before. On a hunch, I decided to check it out. As I pulled into the restaurant's lot, I spotted her car immediately. It was parked near the entrance, unmistakable with its personalized license plate. I felt a lump form in my throat as I scanned the windows, searching for any sign of her. Sure enough, there she was, sitting at a corner table with Rick. They were leaning in close, their heads almost touching. She was laughing at something he said, her smile wide and genuine in a way I hadn't seen in months. He reached across the table and placed his hand on hers, and she didn't pull away. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I sat there in my car, frozen, watching as the scene played out like some terrible movie. Lisa and Rick looked comfortable, intimate even. This wasn't a business meeting, it was something else entirely. For a moment, I considered confronting them right then and there. I imagined storming into the restaurant, demanding answers, making a scene. But as angry and hurt as I felt, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. I needed proof. I grabbed my phone and snapped a few pictures from my car. They weren't perfect, taken through the windshield and at a distance, but they were clear enough to show what was happening. My hands were shaking as I drove home, my mind racing with questions. How long had this been going on? Was it just a fling, or something more? And why Rick, of all people? I'd met the guy at company events, shared polite conversations with him. I'd never suspected he could be capable of something like this. When Lisa came home later that night, I pretended to be asleep. I didn't trust myself to speak to her without losing my temper. She climbed into bed, her movements careful and quiet, as if she knew I might be awake. I stared at the ceiling for hours, my mind spinning in circles. The woman I'd built my life with, the person I thought I knew better than anyone else, had betrayed me. The proof was there, undeniable and damning. Now I just had to figure out what to do with it. The next morning was one of the hardest of my life. I woke up early, my chest heavy with the weight of what I'd seen the night before. Lisa was still asleep beside me, her face calm and peaceful, as if everything was perfectly normal. I stared at her, torn between anger and heartbreak. How could she do this to me? To us? For 10 years, I'd thought we had a solid marriage. Sure, we had our ups and downs, but nothing that couldn't be worked through. Now, I wasn't so sure. I spent the day replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of it all. The laughter, the touch of her hand, the look in her eyes when she was with Rick, it was all so vivid, and yet I still struggled to believe it. By the time Lisa woke up, I'd already decided not to confront her. Not yet. I needed to process what I was feeling first. Morning, she said groggily, wrapping her arms around me as I sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee. Morning, I replied, forcing a smile. She kissed me on the cheek and poured herself a cup of coffee, completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. It felt surreal, sitting there and pretending everything was fine when all I wanted to do was scream at her, demand answers, and make her explain herself. But I couldn't. Not yet. Over the next few days, I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the mess that had become my life. But no matter how busy I stayed, the thoughts crept in, the lies, the betrayal, the deceit. I couldn't escape them. Lisa, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had happened. She still came home late, still spent hours on her phone, and still gave me the same tired excuses. I started to notice even more red flags, the way she avoided eye contact, the way she tensed up when I asked about her day, the way she deflected any questions about Rick. One evening, I decided to test her. "So, how's Rick doing?" I asked casually as we sat down for dinner. She froze for a split second, just long enough for me to notice. "He's fine," she said, shrugging. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. You've been spending a lot of time with him lately." Her fork clattered against her plate as she set it down. "He's my boss, Dan. Of course I spend time with him. Can we not do this right now?" "Do what?" I pressed, my tone calm but firm. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "This. The insinuations, the jealousy. It's exhausting. I'm working hard to build a better life for us, and all you can do is question me. Her words stung, but I couldn't back down. I'm not insinuating anything, Lisa. I'm just trying to understand why you've been so distant lately. I'm not distant, she snapped. I'm busy. There's a difference. The conversation ended there, but the tension lingered. That night, as she slept beside me, I pulled out my phone and stared at the pictures I'd taken. They were proof of what I'd seen, but they didn't answer the bigger questions swirling in my head. Was this just a fling? Or was it something deeper? And more importantly, could I ever forgive her for it? The pain of realizing the woman I loved had betrayed me was unbearable. It wasn't just the betrayal itself, it was the realization that the life I thought we built together might have been a lie. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, caught between denial and anger. I needed answers. And sooner or later, Lisa would have to give them to me. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. I wasn't ready, but honestly, I don't think I ever would have been. It was a quiet evening, one of those rare nights when Lisa wasn't working late. We were sitting in the living room, the TV playing some mindless show neither of us was paying attention to. She was scrolling on her phone, her face lit by the glow of the screen. I couldn't hold it in any longer. Lisa, I said, my voice steady but firm. She didn't look up. We need to talk. That got her attention. She set her phone down and turned to me, her brow furrowed. What's this about? I took a deep breath, feeling my chest tighten. I know about you and Rick. Her face went pale. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stared at me like a deer caught in headlights. What are you talking about? She finally said, her voice shaking just enough to betray her. Don't, I said, shaking my head. Don't lie to me. I saw you. At the restaurant. I saw the way you were with him. She blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing as if she were searching for the right words. Then, suddenly, her expression changed. The guilt was gone, replaced by something colder. You were spying on me, she said, her voice rising. That's unbelievable, Dan. What kind of husband does that? The audacity of her response left me stunned. Are you serious right now? You're turning this on me. You invaded my privacy, she shot back, her eyes blazing. What gives you the right to follow me around like some paranoid lunatic? I could feel my anger bubbling to the surface. What gives me the right? I'm your husband, Lisa. I have every right to know if you're cheating on me. Her face twisted into a sneer. Cheating? Is that what you think? God, Dan, you're so pathetic. If you weren't so emotionally unavailable, maybe I wouldn't have to go elsewhere for support. Her words hit me like a freight train. So, you're admitting it, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She folded her arms, her gaze defiant. You know what? Fine. Yes, Rick and I have been spending time together. But maybe if you paid more attention to me, it wouldn't have come to this. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was blaming me for her betrayal, twisting the knife even deeper. You're unbelievable, I said, standing up. I've always supported you, Lisa. I've always been there for you. And this is how you repay me. She rolled her eyes, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Oh, please. Supporting me? You barely even notice me anymore, Dan. All you care about is your own little world. At least Rick appreciates what I bring to the table. Hearing his name come out of her mouth like that made my blood boil. He's using you, Lisa. He doesn't care about you. You're just another notch on his belt. That seemed to strike a nerve. Her face flushed with anger, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out physically. "You don't know anything about him," she shouted. "He respects me, Dan. He values me in a way you never have." The argument spiraled from there, turning into a shouting match that left both of us emotionally drained. By the end of it, Lisa stormed out of the room, slamming the bedroom door behind her. I sat there in the silence, my hands trembling and my heart racing. Her words kept replaying in my mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. Was she right? Had I been distant? Had I failed her in some way? No. I shook my head, refusing to let her manipulate me into thinking this was my fault. I wasn't perfect, but I'd never given her a reason to stray. This was on her, not me. Still, the damage was done. My confidence was shattered, my trust obliterated. Lisa's betrayal had turned my world upside down, and I had no idea how to put the pieces back together. After our explosive argument, the house became eerily quiet. Lisa and I barely spoke to each other, each retreating to our separate corners. She stayed locked away in the bedroom or buried herself in work, while I spent most of my time at the office or aimlessly driving around town. The silence gave me too much time to think. The betrayal played on a loop in my head, the laughter I'd seen at the restaurant, the way she'd touched his hand, the defiant way she admitted her actions and then blamed me. Every memory was like a fresh wound. But after the initial shock wore off, anger began to take over. I wasn't just angry at Lisa, I was furious at Rick, too. He wasn't just some random stranger, he was her boss, a man I'd met, spoken to, even shared drinks with at company events. The sheer audacity of their betrayal made my blood boil. I knew I couldn't let them get away with it. But what could I do? Confronting Lisa hadn't gotten me anywhere, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my life feeling like a victim. I needed to take control of the situation, to make sure they both faced the consequences of their actions. I started by gathering evidence. The pictures I'd taken at the restaurant were a start, but I needed more. If I was going to expose Lisa and Rick, I had to make sure there was no room for doubt. I began paying closer attention to Lisa's schedule, noting when she claimed to have late meetings or work events. Whenever I could, I followed her from a distance, keeping my phone ready to document anything suspicious. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. One evening, Lisa told me she was heading to an after-hours brainstorming session with her team. I waited until she left, then followed her car to a small, upscale hotel on the edge of town. She parked, got out, and walked inside without looking back. I sat in my car, heart pounding, debating what to do next. Part of me wanted to storm in after her, but I held back. Instead, I waited, phone in hand, until I saw Rick arrive a few minutes later. He was dressed casually, his usual air of smug confidence on full display. I snapped several photos as he entered the hotel, then stayed parked outside for over an hour. When they finally came out, laughing and looking far too comfortable, I got a few more pictures before driving away. The evidence was damning, but I wasn't done yet. I started digging into Rick's background, using every resource I could think of. It turned out he wasn't as untouchable as he liked to pretend. Through some online sleuthing, I discovered that his reputation in the industry wasn't as spotless as Lisa believed. There were rumors of inappropriate relationships, questionable business practices, and even a lawsuit or two that had been quietly settled out of court. The pieces of my plan began to fall into place. I decided to hit them where it would hurt the most, their professional lives. Lisa's career was everything to her, and Rick's position as her boss gave him a lot to lose. If I could expose their affair to the right people, it wouldn't just ruin their personal lives, it could destroy their professional reputations as well. I compiled everything I had: photos, timelines, records of Lisa's unexplained absences, and started drafting an anonymous letter. It was addressed to the HR department of Lisa's company, detailing her inappropriate relationship with her boss and providing the evidence to back it up. I also included the information I'd found about Rick's past indiscretions, ensuring that the company would take the matter seriously. As I sealed the envelope, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, satisfaction, and a deep sadness that it had come to this. I didn't want to destroy Lisa's career, but I couldn't let her betrayal go unanswered. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about justice. It didn't take long for the wheels to start turning after I sent the letter. I mailed it anonymously, taking care to ensure there was no way it could be traced back to me. I also emailed the same evidence to a few higher-ups in Lisa's company from a burner account, just to make sure it couldn't be ignored. The fallout started less than a week later. Lisa came home one evening, her face pale and her hands trembling as she dropped her bag on the counter. I could tell something was wrong immediately, but I played it cool, waiting for her to speak. HR called me in for a meeting today, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Oh. I replied, keeping my tone neutral. They said someone filed a complaint about me. About Rick. I sipped my coffee, hiding the satisfaction bubbling beneath the surface. What kind of complaint? She glared at me, her eyes narrowing. Don't play dumb, Dan. I know you had something to do with this. I shrugged, feigning innocence. I have no idea what you're talking about. Lisa slammed her hand on the counter. Don't lie to me. They have pictures, timelines, everything. This wasn't some random complaint, it was personal. Her outburst confirmed what I already knew: my plan had worked. The evidence I'd sent was too damning to ignore, and now she was scrambling to save herself. They're launching an investigation, she continued, pacing back and forth. Rick's furious. He thinks someone's trying to take him down. I almost laughed at the irony of her words. She and Rick had no problem betraying me, but the moment their actions had consequences, they acted like the victims. What do you want me to say, Lisa? I finally said, setting my mug down. Maybe you should have thought about this before getting involved with your boss. Her face turned red, a mix of anger and embarrassment. You don't understand, Dan. You don't know how hard I've worked for my career. This could ruin everything. I stood up, my voice cold and steady. You ruined everything, Lisa. Not me. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. She didn't have a response for that. Instead, she stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. The next few days were a whirlwind. I heard bits and pieces of what was happening through Lisa's muted phone calls and whispered conversations. Rick had been called in for questioning, and rumors about their relationship were spreading through the office like wildfire. Then, one evening, Lisa came home in tears. They suspended me, she said, her voice cracking. Pending the investigation. She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Rick's been demoted. He won't even talk to me anymore. The news didn't surprise me. Men like Rick didn't stick around when things got tough. He'd probably been stringing Lisa along the whole time, using her for his own gain. Now that his career was on the line, he was cutting ties to save himself. What did you expect? I said, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Lisa looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy. I didn't think it would end like this, she whispered. I thought he cared about me. Her words stung, but I didn't let it show. Well, now you know the truth. Just like I had to find out about you. She didn't say anything after that, and I didn't press her. The damage was done, and there was no going back. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of closure. Lisa and Rick had made their choices, and now they were facing the consequences. And for once, I wasn't the one left picking up the pieces. Lisa's suspension turned into termination within a week. The company didn't release all the details, but the official reason was a violation of their code of conduct. I knew it wasn't just about her affair with Rick, it was about the chaos their relationship had brought into the workplace. Rick didn't fare much better. Though he wasn't fired outright, he was demoted to a position far below his previous role, effectively ending his rise in the company. Word spread quickly through their industry, and the once respected executive was now a subject of hushed gossip and scorn. As for Lisa, she was devastated. Losing her job was more than just a financial blow, it was a hit to her identity. She had poured everything into her career, and now it was gone. "You happy now?" she asked me one evening, her voice dripping with bitterness. "Happy?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "No, Lisa, I'm not happy. But I'm not the one who caused this mess, you are." She flinched at my words but didn't argue. Deep down, I think she knew I was right. Rick, of course, wasted no time distancing himself from her. He stopped answering her calls and messages, leaving her to face the fallout alone. The man she'd risked everything for had abandoned her when she needed him most. The irony wasn't lost on me. Meanwhile, I began preparing for the next phase of my plan, the divorce. I'd already contacted a lawyer and started gathering evidence to ensure the proceedings went in my favor. The photos, the timelines, the documentation of Lisa's affair, it all painted a clear picture of her betrayal. When I finally told her I wanted a divorce, she didn't even argue. "Fine," she said quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. "If that's what you want." "It's not what I wanted, Lisa," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But you didn't leave me much of a choice." The process was surprisingly quick. With the evidence I had, the court ruled in my favor on nearly every front. The house? It stayed with me. The cars? I kept mine, and she was left with hers. Financially, she was on her own. Watching her pack up her belongings and move out was bittersweet. Part of me still loved the woman I'd married, the woman who used to laugh with me, dream with me, and build a life with me. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. As for Lisa, she spiraled after the divorce. Without her job, her relationship with Rick, or the stability of our marriage, she seemed completely lost. I heard through mutual friends that she struggled to find work and eventually had to move in with her sister. There was no satisfaction in seeing her like that. If anything, it was a stark reminder of how far we'd both fallen from the life we once shared. For me, the end of our marriage was painful but also liberating. I no longer had to carry the weight of her betrayal, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined when we first said our vows, but it was the one we'd come to. The divorce marked the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. In the weeks and months that followed, I found myself grappling with a mix of emotions, sadness, anger, relief, and, eventually, a sense of clarity. For the first time in years, I had the space to reflect on who I was and what I wanted. I realized that I had spent so much of my marriage trying to support Lisa's dreams that I'd forgotten to focus on my own. Now, I had a chance to rediscover what made me happy. At first, it wasn't easy. The house felt empty without her, and there were days when the loneliness was almost unbearable. But with time, I started to fill the silence with things that brought me peace. I took up running, something I hadn't done since college. I reconnected with old friends and even joined a local hiking group. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild my life. One of the hardest parts was letting go of the anger. For a long time, I carried a deep resentment toward Lisa and Rick, replaying their betrayal over and over in my mind. But holding on to that anger only kept me tethered to the past, and I knew I couldn't move forward until I let it go. Forgiveness didn't come overnight, and it didn't mean forgetting what happened. But eventually, I learned to separate myself from their actions. Their choices were a reflection of who they were, not who I was. As for Lisa, I heard through the grapevine that she was still struggling. She'd bounced between a few jobs but hadn't been able to regain the career momentum she'd once had. Rick, on the other hand, had left the company entirely and moved to another city, likely trying to escape the fallout of his actions. I didn't feel sorry for either of them. They'd made their bed, and now they had to lie in it. The experience taught me a lot about myself and about relationships. I learned the importance of setting boundaries, of trusting my instincts, and of never taking loyalty for granted. But perhaps the most important lesson was this: even in the face of betrayal, life goes on. 1 year after the divorce, I stood on the porch of the house I'd fought so hard to keep, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The pain of the past still lingered, but it no longer defined me. I was stronger now, wiser, too. And while I didn't know what the future held, I knew I was ready to face it, one step at a time. If there's one piece of advice I'd give to anyone going through something similar, it's this: don't let someone else's actions dictate your worth. You deserve honesty, respect, and love, and if someone can't give you that, you're better off without them. Life isn't always fair, but it has a way of balancing the scales. And sometimes, what feels like the end is really just the beginning.